Well, it is great to see all of you here on this beautiful, sunny summer morning. Hey, today we are finishing up the series that we've been doing, a series of messages that we are calling Divine Direction. And what we've been doing is we've been discussing, what is it that we do when we're seeking to know the direction that God wants us to go, whether it's a big decision we need to make or if it's a change that needs to happen. When we're seeking direction from God, how do we find that? So that's what we've been doing in Divine Direction. And week one, what we did is we talked about how if we want to know what to do, that what we need to focus on is becoming more like Christ. So making sure that our motives were right was important. So we learned that when we focus on the who we are, and then we focus on our motives and making sure our motives are pure, then God will lead us into the right direction that He wants us to go. And then in the second week, we talked about the fact that, there are times when the Bible is really clear and it just tells us how we're supposed to. There's certain things the Bible says do this, and there's certain things the Bible says don't do. But there's a lot of stuff in our life when we're seeking direction where God doesn't give us this exact answer or very specific direction for our lives. And in those situations when he may not tell us exactly what decision we should make, we learn that God will always give us the wisdom to decide as long as we ask and seek His wisdom. Now, last week, we talked about trusting in God's process. And we went through this process. And what we're going to do today as we wrap up the series is we're going to unpack that process a little bit more. Now, I don't care how old you are. If you're 8 or if you're 88, it's my prayer that God is going to stir up something inside of you, some divine direction for you today. Some of you probably already have this stirring inside of you, and maybe you don't know what it is, and some of you, it may be a completely new thing. But I want you to, what I'm hoping is that we'll be able to take a step away from where we are and a step of faith into something else that God wants us to do, right? It might be that he's nudging some of us to go back to school and pursue a specific degree or to start over in a relationship that you've lost trust in. Maybe it's someone in here needs to start some counseling because you've been trying on your own to get over some of your past hurts, but you just can't do it by yourself. Maybe it's to start a new job or to start a ministry or just to start tithing. I don't know what it's going to be that God is going to do in your life, but if you'll take a step toward God's direction, then the reality is that sometimes in order to do that, like if we want to take a step in God's direction, we sometimes have to step away from our own security, right? Sometimes we have to take a step away from our own security if we want to start something new. When starting something new, the challenge for so many people is the start, right? It's often, if we're honest with ourselves, it's often the start that stops us. And we've all seen the before and after pictures, right? Somebody posts a picture and, it was like, I used to weigh 240 pounds, and now after all the stuff I did, now I'm 120 and I'm a size 6. And, right, we love to see those kinds of before and after success stories. And we want to do that in an area of our life, but we don't know how to start oftentimes. And so when we don't know, we don't start, right? It's the start that often stops us. Now, this may seem like a very obvious statement for me to make, but it's so important. You will never, ever finish anything that you don't start, right? You'll never finish anything you don't start. And so today, in our final week, seeking this divine direction and trying to discover how we can receive divine direction from God, I am actually praying, I've been praying this week that God would give some of you the faith to start in a new direction that's going to alter the course of the rest of your life. And to do it, we're going to look at this guy named Nehemiah from the Old Testament. Now, let me give you a little bit of backstory. If you don't know about Nehemiah, prior to the story that Jill read in the book of Nehemiah, God basically told His people, right? He told the Israelites, He told the chosen people, here's what He said. He said, I want you to obey, and I want you to worship me. Unfortunately, the people didn't obey, and they didn't worship God. And so God allowed the Babylonians, this other group of people, God allowed the Babylonians to come in and to destroy everything that mattered to the people. The Babylonians wiped out the temple. They demolished the wall that was around the city. They then burned most of the city, and they took God's people into captivity. And then 140 years later, right? Imagine, don't just pass that number up. Imagine 140 years. We're talking generations later. There's a remnant that goes back to this homeland to say, you know what? We need to try to rebuild this temple that was destroyed 140 years ago. But they're discouraged, and honestly, they're embarrassed about where they are at this point in life as a people. And so things aren't really going anywhere. Nothing's happening. Until suddenly, God gives one man, Nehemiah, he gives this one man what we're going to call today a divine burden. Okay, he gives him this burden. See, Nehemiah, he hears about what's happening in Jerusalem. And he says, you know what? I'm not okay with that. The fact that our city, the city of God really, God's place that he's given to his holy people, it's in ruins. I'm not okay with this. This is God's place, and we are God's people. And I'm just not going to allow any more of this to happen. So Nehemiah basically is saying, as long as I'm alive, I'm not going to stand for this. I love the phrase, a divine burden. See, some of you have a divine burden. Some of you may not even know that you have a burden. Some of you might be thinking, oh, I've never said that thing is a divine burden, but there's something in your life that when you look at it, you think, I'm not okay with that. And because I'm a Jesus follower and because of what I understand about God and his heart, I can't sit by and let some injustice continue to prevail. Right? There may be something in your life where you just look on and say, somebody has got to do something about that, whatever that is. And then at some point you think, well, it may as well be me to do something about it. You know, I had a professor back in seminary that I've stayed in touch with over the years. His name is Joe Halbert, and Joe loves running. Now, when I say Joe loves running, I don't mean that he runs a few miles a day and he does a couple 5Ks throughout the year. Joe's crazy. He runs like tons of marathons every year. He's done those 100-mile adventure races, and he's done this thing where you run from sunup to sundown. And I mean, the guy just loves running, but he also has this burden to help fund clean water projects in third world countries. And so Joe, every time he runs a marathon, every time he does some race and he picks like crazier ones just to try and grab people's attention, he does them as fundraisers to raise money for clean water projects. I got in touch with Joe this week and I just said, hey Joe, I was thinking about you as I was prepping this sermon, and I'm wondering, how many miles have you run in these fundraisers, and how much money have you raised? And he said, I've run 11,000 miles and I've raised $50,000. Now, you know, some people can just write a check for $50,000. Joe can't, and so Joe has now taken this love of running and this divine burden to fund these clean water projects. He says, I'm going to do whatever I can do. And he's raised $50,000. See, your divine burden often reveals your divine direction. So what's burdening you may actually show you what God wants you to do. You know, you may think that it's a tragedy, that right here in the Chicago area, there are children that aren't in a good home. And you think, you know, somebody's got to do something about this. Now, I can't foster all of the children in Chicago that need a good home, but I could foster one. I wish I could find the statistic. I looked this week and I couldn't find it, so maybe I'm making it up. But I heard years ago when my wife and I were going through the adoption process that if one family from each church in the United States would adopt one child through just would foster one child that's in the foster system in America, that there would be a waiting list of churches waiting to get foster children. That's just one family in each church. This divine burden reveals our divine direction. And see, this is what happened to Nehemiah. Some of you are going to have that moment, and you're just going to say, you know what, I can't take it anymore. Somebody needs to do something about this, and it may as well be me. Divine burden reveals divine direction. Now, what's interesting when you look at Nehemiah, he was like the least likely guy to ever go and rebuild the wall around the city of Jerusalem. If you don't know Nehemiah, his job was that he was cupbearer to the Babylonian king. Right? A cupbearer is not somebody who's in construction, right? He's not a general contractor. He has no wall building experience whatsoever. Now, the cupbearer, what his job was to test the wine before the king drank it to make sure that it wasn't poisoned, right? So if you do your job well, you die. That was Nehemiah's job. I'll drink it first, make sure it's not poisoned, then I give it to the king. Right? So here's the guy who doesn't seem to be qualified at all, with a burden, thinking, I have got to do something about this. Now, God may call you to a similar situation where you're not qualified, but He gave you a burden. And because He's the one that gave you the burden, that means He trusts you to do something about it. So what do you do when God starts to use this burden in your life to take you in a new direction? Well, the first thing that Nehemiah did is that he took it to God. He got down on his knees and he prayed this really powerful prayer. If we look at Nehemiah 1, 5 and 6, he says this. This is Nehemiah speaking. He's praying. He says, Lord, the God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps His covenant of love with those who love Him and keep His commandments, let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer of your servant is praying before you day and night for your servants, the people of Israel. I confess the sins we Israelites, including myself and my father's family, have committed against you. I love this. So what's the first thing that you do when your burden starts moving you in a direction? You take it to God in prayer. See, so Nehemiah, he prayed for favor before the king. He prayed to God that he would have favor before the king. And then Nehemiah, after he prays for favor in front of the king, he goes in front of the king. And this is crazy, but he says this. Nehemiah goes up and he's like, look, king, I know this is a little weird here, but would you, the king, bless me, this cupbearer? Would you bless me to leave my job and to leave where I live and travel 850 miles to the city of Jerusalem and to start this project to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem and to redeem the reputation of God among the nations? Remember, this king was Babylonian king. The Babylonians were the ones that brought all of God's people into slavery, into captivity. They're the ones that destroyed it in the first place. And now Nehemiah is going before him saying, hey, can you let me go back? Not just rebuild this wall, but to redeem the reputation of our God amongst the nations. And God moves the king's heart to allow Nehemiah to go. So now Nehemiah, with permission to go, Nehemiah can start. He's got a huge project in front of him, and so where should he begin? So thought number one for today, if you're taking notes, if you want to scribble this down, how do you do something big? Start small. How do you do something big? You start small. I love the imagery from the book of Zechariah, chapter 4, verse 10. It says this, do not despise these small beginnings, for the Lord rejoices to see the work begin. Do not despise, right? Don't be embarrassed. Don't be ashamed of starting small, because what's the Lord going to do? See, the Lord rejoices to see the work begin. See, if you have a burden from God and the task just seems overwhelming, it seems daunting, it seems too big, don't let the start stop you. Start small. Just make sure that you start. And when we think about Nehemiah, oftentimes we hear this story. If we were to read the whole thing, we think, okay, so Nehemiah had a burden, and he prays, and then he asks the king, and then he goes and he builds the wall. But what's interesting is if you go to the very end and you trace back all the steps, it's actually really encouraging to us. Right? At the end, we see that he built the wall. But if you go back a step before the wall was built, what did they do? The people worked their tails off. And if you go back another step, what did they do? The text actually says that the people worked with a tool in one hand and a weapon in the other to fight off the opposition. And then if you go back a step before that, somebody had the courage to just lay down that first stone. If you go back another step, you'll actually see Nehemiah trying to rally the people who didn't believe that this could even happen, right? He has his Braveheart moment, right? And he says, fight for your fathers, fight for your brothers, and fight for your sisters, and fight for your future children, fight for God. And he motivates the people to rebuild the wall, which is the beginning of rebuilding the city. If you go back another step before that, you see Nehemiah, it says that he investigated things by night. He's walking around taking notes. He's trying to say, okay, how are we going to do this? How's this going to work? What do I need to do here? You go back a step before that, and it actually shows him waiting 3 days. You go back a step before that, he had to travel 850 miles, probably on a donkey. Our mission trip kids were like, man, it's a long trip to Nashville in these minivans. Like 850 miles on a donkey was what Nehemiah did. It's a long trip. Before that, what did he do before he took the trip? He had to pack his bag, right? The starting small part is the packing your bag. We have to have the faith to start small. And so that's what Nehemiah did. It shows us in chapter 2, in verses 17 and 18, Nehemiah, he gathers all of the chief officials around, and he gathers the priests and the nobles, and he says to them, you see the trouble that we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins. Its gates have been burned with fire. Come and let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace. I also then told them about the gracious hand of my God on me and what the king had said to me. And they replied, let us start rebuilding. And so they began this good work. See, Nehemiah, he's experiencing this process that we talked about last week. See, first, he's experienced the Spirit's prompting, right? That's the burden that the Spirit laid on Nehemiah's heart. So he's got this prompting from the Spirit. And then he has to start without knowing all the details. So that was the second thing we talked about last week, was that we're going to have the Spirit's prompting, and then we're going to face certain uncertainty. He didn't have all the details, so he had this certain uncertainty about life. It's important for all of us to know, and you can write this part down, you don't have to have the faith to finish. That's oftentimes what we seek. But you don't have to have the faith to finish. You just have to have the faith to start. Right? You don't have to have the faith to say, I can see exactly how we're going to rebuild this wall. I can see it all the way from the first stone to the end. You don't have to have that. You just have to have the faith to put down that first stone. I hope that this speaks to somebody here right now in this room, right? Like, I'm not just talking because this will be on the internet later. Like, I hope this affects somebody this morning, that you don't have to know all of the details. We talked about last week how God probably won't give you all the details because we probably can't handle all of the details. But He's going to lead you in a direction, and you have to take the first step. Right? You don't have to have the faith to finish. You just have to have the faith to start. I was terrified to start seminary. I've shared with you before, and you've laughed at me when I've shared this, but I've shared with you how I was never a good student. I mean, all the way through high school and even through college and my undergrad, school was never easy for me. And so when I felt God at almost 30 years old prompting me to go back to school and to start seminary, I did not see this ending well for me. But God showed me that I didn't have to have the faith to finish. He would work out all of the details, and He'd reveal to me different steps along the way as I needed them. I just needed to have the faith to start. And to be honest with you, I thought when I started seminary that I knew what the finish looked like. You kind of map out, it's going to take me this long, I'll take these classes, I'll do this. And none of my seminary went that way. I actually switched seminaries halfway through. Right? If I'd known all the details, I probably wouldn't have started. But He gave them to me as I needed them. See, you never finish something that you don't start. And somebody here needs to trust God and start something today. So the first thing is that you need to start small. Okay, the second big point that I want you to remember is that you need to take the next step. Take the next step. So start small and then take the next step. And this is what Nehemiah has done. Chapter 2, verses 19 through 20. But when Sanballat the Hornite, Tobiah the Ammonite official, and Geshem the Arab heard about it, so when they heard about what Nehemiah was doing, They mocked and ridiculed us. What is this you're doing, they asked. Are you rebelling against the king? I answered them by saying, the God of heaven will give us success. We, his servants, will start rebuilding. So just like we talked last week, right? Nehemiah has now experienced the Spirit's prompting. He's dealt with certain uncertainty. And now this predictive resistance. We talked about predictable resistance, right? Don't let the resistance stop you. Take the next step. Let God prompt you, and then take a step, and then take another step, and then take another step. You know, I don't know who needs to hear that this morning, but there's something that's been on your mind for a long time. You know, it might be that you're like, man, I really need to work on my finances, and I need to get out of debt, and how do I do that? Like it just seems too big. I'm supposed to save this $1,000 emergency fund is what they tell me is the first step of getting out of debt. I can't even fathom how I would save this emergency fund. Well, just decide not to go out to eat once, or not to stop for fast food, and don't stop and ask for that $5 coffee, right? Go find something at your house and put it up on eBay, and before you know it, just with a few small decisions, you're $85 of the way there to that $1,000 goal. It may be that some of you know that God is giving you this burden to spend more time with him, to pursue a relationship with him at a deeper level than you've been doing. But you're so easily distracted by all the things of this world. And so how do you pursue God? How do you become more like Christ? Well, I mean, you do something small. You start. You pick a book of the Bible and say, I'm going to read this and study a little bit about this. And every morning when I wake up, I'm going to begin my day with some devotional time. And then maybe you start thinking, I come to church and I keep hearing Pastor Steve talk to me about how I should sign up for some sort of ministry here at the church where I should serve because he keeps saying we're all supposed to serve. And so before you know it, you're serving in an area of ministry and you're seeing that other people's lives are changed. The next thing you know, you're actually part of impacting someone's life. Right? Don't ever let the start stop you. I love what St. Francis of Assisi said. He said, start doing what's necessary. Then what's possible, and suddenly you're doing the impossible. Right? Start doing what's necessary, and then what's possible, and suddenly you're doing the impossible. And this is what Nehemiah did. He had a divine burden, and divine burden often reveals the divine direction that God wants us to go in. Right? He goes into prayer to God and he says, God, give me favor as I step out and go before the king. And then he goes in front of the king and says, King, would you give me permission? And then he packs a bag. And we need to pack our bag. And we need to just grab the toothbrush and the toothpaste and the little things. We need to stick them in there. And then we need to get out on the donkey and go. Take that step. See, what's miraculous is that the people built this wall without the modern equipment we have. They built a wall around Jerusalem in 52 days, which, according to some biblical scholars, is amazing. Now, we look at that and we think, hey, project complete, great story about Nehemiah. But we have to wait and we have to think. After the wall was completed, there was a whole lot more that still needed to happen, right? Then they needed to rebuild the economy, and they needed to rebuild the culture, and they needed to rebuild among the people of God the passion and obedience to the one true God. That's why we started this series off, and we've reminded you each week that this is not a series called Divine Destination, because it's not about arriving somewhere. Right? What we're supposed to do is that we're supposed to move in the direction that Jesus is calling us in. And we're supposed to do that one thing. And when you do that one thing, none of us really know what's on the other side of that thing. Right? Who knows what is on the other side of our first step of obedience? You don't have to have the faith to finish. You just have to have the faith to start. Right? We can dream big. We just have to be willing to start small. But the most important part is start. Start right where you are. And then one day, you may be able to look back and realize that very small step that you took was that first step in the divine direction was actually one of the biggest steps that you'd ever taken in your life. It was that small thing that seemed insignificant, and now it's the biggest faith-changing moment that you can ever look back on. Because you had no idea what our good God would do on the other side of your small start. Galatians chapter 6, verse 9 says this, "Do not grow weary in doing good. For at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up." Do not grow weary in doing good. Take a step. And then take another step. And then take another step. But start it. It's in you. God has a plan for every single one of us. There is a burden that He has on your heart. It's up to us to just be open to it and to take the step and to start it. God gave you that burden. Let's start it. Would you pray with me?